You think laundry is bad now? Sorting delicates, wrestling with mismatched socks, discovering that one red sock that turned your entire wardrobe pink? Cute. Try ancient Babylon, where your laundry machine was a clay vat, your detergent was lye that could melt skin, and your washing assistant was your foot. Yes, you stomped out stains like a medieval winemaker with a vendetta. Add desert heat, sewage runoff, and absolutely zero fabric softener. And voila, fresh linens. Or at least, less filthy linens. Welcome to laundry before Tide Pods. You'll never complain about your spin cycle again. If you're enjoying this bizarre sudsy spiral through history, scrub that like button clean and let the algorithm gods know you're into ancient grime. Subscribing? That's the rinse cycle. Let's begin with something no one asked for but everyone needs. A deep, immersive inhale of ancient filth. Picture this. A place that gave us writing, irrigation, and arguably the first recorded hangover. Yes, ancient Mesopotamia, specifically Babylon. The glittering jewel of the Fertile Crescent, and incidentally, a place that absolutely reeked. Not metaphorically. Literally. While modern cities grapple with car exhaust and the occasional overflowing dumpster, Babylon had a far more artisanal approach to filth. Their streets were paved with compacted dust, animal dung, and good intentions. Add to that a generous helping of human waste, and you've got yourself a truly handcrafted experience in Biohazard. Now, before you go judging ancient people for their personal scent profile, let's give them some credit. They were working with what they had, which, to be fair, was not much. Plumbing? A distant dream. Disinfectant? Plea. Most people thought disease was a vibe, a punishment from gods who just weren't vibing with your lifestyle that week. And so, into the mud brick cityscape we descend. Imagine waking up in your modest one-room home, its walls lovingly plastered with clay and moldy. You rise from your reed mat and stretch, careful not to knock over the family's prized possessions. A broken jug, a goat, and your uncle, who's been sleeping in the corner since last barley harvest. The air is thick with heat and dust. A fine, powdery mix of desert sand, cooking fires, and the faint suggestion that something died nearby, possibly in your water supply. Your first task: fetch water, which by the way is located half a mile away in a canal teeming with tadpoles, fish guts, and your neighbor's laundry runoff. So, hydration secured. Now it's time for grooming, which for most Babylonians meant spitting into your hands, smoothing your hair, and hoping the gods were distracted today. Deodorant? If you were lucky, you could mask your body odor with burnt incense or a handful of crushed myrrh. If not, you were just another humble pilgrim offering your armpits to the divine. And let's talk about sweat. Babylonian summers made modern heat waves look like polite coughs from the sun. With temperatures often climbing past 100 BOF, or as they called it, Wednesday, sweat wasn't just a possibility, it was your lifestyle. You didn't wear clothes so much as you soaked them. This brings us, regrettably, to footwear. Sandals, optional. Sewer runoff, mandatory. The streets of Babylon were essentially a choose-your-own-adventure of bodily fluids, open drains, communal cesspits, and irrigation canals that pulled double duty as both lifelines and latrines. Sanitation wasn't just primitive, it was practically theoretical. Now, were there exceptions? Of course. The wealthy elite had slightly better odds at cleanliness. Some had private lavatories, glorified holes in the floor, and servants to dispose of their, shall we say, moral excess. But even the richest man in Babylon had to contend with the same dust, heat, and general aura funk as everyone else. So why didn't people, clean more? Because cleanliness as we know it today didn't exist. The ancient Mesopotamian mind didn't separate dirty from deadly. They weren't scrubbing to kill bacteria. They were trying to appease Ishtar and avoid bad omens. Illness came from evil spirits, bad dreams, or stepping on the wrong tablet during a full moon. If you got sick, it wasn't because you hadn't washed your hands, it was because Marduk was having a rough day. That's not to say they didn't value appearance. They loved elaborate beards, kohl eyeliner, and linen garments when they could afford them. But these things were signs of wealth and beauty, not personal hygiene. Smelling like yesterday's ox cart, a minor inconvenience. Smelling too good, suspicious frankly, possibly divine interference. And now, the pièce de résistance, camel poop. Not just metaphorical, literal camel poop. Camels, donkeys, goats, and whatever else passed for street traffic regularly contributed to Babylon's olfactory symphony. It was a city in constant conversation with its own bowels. Let that sink in, dust and all. But don't mistake this for laziness. On the contrary, Mesopotamians were some of the hardest working people on earth. They toiled under sun and sky to plant barley, craft beer, and build ziggurats with nothing but mud bricks and sheer cosmic spite. They just didn't have the time or the knowledge to care about germs. Germs weren't discovered until about 3,000 years later, which is unfortunate for the people who drank from the same river they bathed in. Oh right, bathing, that rare, precious act. If you were lucky, or extremely fancy, you might bathe in a river once in a while, maybe even with soap made from ash and lard. We'll get to that horror show in a future chapter. For now, suffice it to say that full-body rinses were the exception, not the rule. Most people spot cleaned. You'd splash some water on your face, wipe your hands on your tunic, which, hilariously, was already filthy, and maybe rinse your feet if you'd been extra holy that day. That's it. That's the whole hygiene routine. There were probably toddlers in Babylon who had cleaner hands than the adults, mostly because toddlers hadn't yet learned to touch everything. So, let's recap. You've got clay walls, mud streets, sacrificial goats, holy diseases, foot sweat tunics, no plumbing, and a belief system that says bathing might offend the gods. Babylon wasn't just dirty, it was inventively dirty. And from this glorious grime, a laundry empire was born. But before we get to the spin cycles of ancient Mesopotamia, there's one burning question to ask. What did the Babylonians actually consider dirty? Spoiler alert, it's not what you'd expect, and it's definitely not their laundry. Let's get one thing straight right away. Laundry in ancient Babylon was not a side quest. It was a full-time job. A gritty, foot-stomping, skin-scalding career. And the people who did it, they weren't casually soaking a few linens between baking barley cakes. They were professionals, or prisoners, often both. Welcome to the world of the Babylonian washerwoman, or man. But let's be real, this job usually fell to women, enslaved people, or the lowest paid laborers in the city. These weren't your sprightly washerfolk singing lullabies by a riverside. These were human stain removers in a brutal world without detergent, gloves, even the basic human right not to be elbow deep in someone else's loincloth stew. Now, you might be picturing a bustling washhouse with bubbly tubs and a soft breeze. Stop that. The Babylonian laundry room was more like a clay-lined trench under an unforgiving sun, filled with tepid water and someone else's sweat. The washer's toolkit included one cracked pot, one bucket of soap ash slurry, one foot for stomping, and 2 raw, blistered hands. No aprons, no softener, just grit, ash, and back pain. The day began before the sun did. While the rest of Babylon slumbered in their mud-brick shoeboxes, the washerwoman was already hauling water from a canal that doubled as the city's toilet. You had to beat the heat, beat the crowd, and occasionally beat away the goats. Once the water was wrangled into oversized vats, it was time to prepare the soap. And this wasn't your lavender-scented artisan bar from Etsy. This was a skin-stripping brew of lye made from wood ash, mixed with animal fat, and if you were lucky, a handful of crushed desert plants. And if you weren't lucky, you got the premium blend, soap cut with fermented human urine, straight from the clay jar it had been brewing in. Just imagine your workplace smells like burnt pig fat and vinegar, and you're about to climb into it barefoot. So, what exactly were you washing? Tunics, mostly, long linen or woolen garments that soaked up sweat like ancient ShamWows. If your client was a priest, you might be laundering ceremonial robes, stained with offerings, and the tears of the repentant. If your client was a merchant, it was probably wine spills and travel dust. And if your client was a soldier, let's just say blood and other fluids, and move along. The method? In theory, simple. In practice, pure medieval cardio. First, soak the clothes, then stomp them into submission. Yes, with your actual feet. It was like making wine, but instead of grapes, it was ancient underpants. After the stomp, you'd beat the fabric with a flat paddle, rinse it in another vat, less filthy if possible, and hang it somewhere birds and small children couldn't reach. Unless the wind changed, or a sandstorm happened, or a neighbor's goat took a bite out of your freshly washed shawl. And all of this This whole hot, frothy, bug-infested operation paid about as well as a wet handshake. If you were a hired worker, you might receive a few shekels, or more often, barley. If you were enslaved, you got nothing but the sweet satisfaction of not being beaten that day, and maybe a crust of bread. Maybe. It's worth pausing here. Ever feel underappreciated at work? Maybe your boss didn't say thank you, or a client sent a passive-aggressive email. Imagine spending 12 hours scrubbing goat blood from your master's robe, only for him to toss it in a puddle 5 minutes later. You want thankless. Try Babylonian laundry duty. And let's not forget the social hierarchy. Washerfolk were generally lumped in with prostitutes and potters, necessary, but never glamorous. If you were really skilled, you might get a regular gig with a temple or a wealthy household. If not, you spent your days washing strangers' clothes while eavesdropping on their business and dodging insult like it was sport. Yet there was an odd kind of power in the role. Laundry workers knew secrets. Blood stains, perfume traces, the occasional hidden scroll sewn into a hem. The washerwoman saw it all. She was invisible in public, but intimately familiar with everyone's dirty laundry. Literally. And you better believe she remembered whose tunics reeked of sacrificial fire and whose just smelled like bad decisions. In fact, some washerfolk were feared for their gossip. There are tablets. Yes, literal cuneiform tablets that include warnings not to trust washerwomen with your linens or your reputation. She'll clean your cloak and ruin your name. One translation might as well read. So the next time you toss a load in the machine and complain about folding, spare a thought for the unnamed workers of Babylon. They didn't just do laundry, they endured it. Through heat, cuts, infections, cracked nails, ruined skin, and aching joints. They trudged home in soggy skirts and blistered heels, knowing they'd wake up and do it all again the next day, because the city and its hierarchy quite literally ran on clean linen. And yet, somewhere between the foot-stomping and the sunburn, there was pride. The washerwoman knew her work mattered. Robes gleamed in temple light, because she scraped them clean. Linen fluttered in the marketplace because she battled mildew and mud. Her touch, invisible, unsung, kept the Babylonian world running with some semblance of dignity. But the tools she used? Oh, they were horrifying. Let's talk about soap. Or rather, the ancient Babylonian version of soap. A substance so brutal, so borderline hazardous, it could probably double as both a cleanser and a mild chemical weapon. You see, in the absence of minty freshness and foamy bath bombs, the Babylonians got creative, by which I mean they weaponized household waste in the name of hygiene. You want clean? You better be ready to burn for it. Their soap, if we dare to call it that, was a concoction of 3 essential ingredients: ash, fat, and urine. That's it. That's the whole recipe. A cocktail so savage it could probably strip paint, dissolve guilt, and exfoliate your soul. But let's walk through it gently, the way a foot soldier might approach a leaky vat of proto-detergent, with curiosity and just a hint of dread. First, wood ash. Ash wasn't just fireplace leftovers, it was gold dust in the ancient world. Rich in potassium carbonate, ash was highly alkaline, which made it ideal for breaking down grime, grease, and whatever Babylonian children decided to roll in that week. Workers would collect ash from hearths, kilns, and burnt offerings. Fun fact, if it came from a sacrificial fire, that ash was technically blessed. So yes, you could spiritually purify your laundry and your sins in one go. 2 birds, 1 ashen stone. Then came the fat. And no, not some dainty dollop of coconut oil. This was animal fat, mutton tallow, goat grease, rendered marrow scraped from bones like prehistoric bacon bits. It smelled about as heavenly as you'd expect when left in a sunlit courtyard for a few days. But combined with the ash, it created a primitive form of lye soap, harsh, caustic, effective, and definitely not gentle on sensitive skin, or any skin really. And then, there was the urine. Yes, human urine, not a metaphor, not a myth. Actual, collected in a pot urine, preferably left out for several days, so it could properly ferment and become what the ancients charmingly referred to as stale. And you didn't just whip up a batch of this at home, no, entire neighborhoods contributed to the cause. Public collection pots stood in alleyways, waiting for generous donations from the bladder-enabled masses. Now let's address the golden question. Why? Because urine, when left to marinate in its own delightful ammonia, becomes a powerful alkaline solution. perfect for dissolving stains, especially oily or protein-based ones. So if your tunic was covered in goat blood and beer as so many were, nothing did the trick quite like a good old-fashioned pea soak. It gets better. Some launderers even got paid for the privilege of handling this elixir. Think about that. Someone in Babylon woke up, dragged a clay jar of week-old human waste into a wash pit, and said, "Ah yes, time to purify the garments." That's dedication. Or madness. Possibly both. Imagine Febreze. But it smells like goat tallow and a hint of ammonia. And while we're on the subject of ancient fragrances, let's take a detour into plant life. Because every now and then, Babylonian soap makers added crushed herbs, flowers, or roots, not to improve the scent as if that were even possible, but to symbolize status or add ritual value. Juniper berries, fenugreek, myrrh. These were the luxury suds. If your laundry smelled faintly herbal, you were either wealthy or laundering temple robes. Either way, people noticed, and not always in a good way. Too clean, too perfumed, suspicious. Maybe you were trying to hide something. Maybe you were consorting with priestesses. Or worse, trying to impress the gods. Soap wasn't just practical, it was social. But don't romanticize it. This wasn't a day at the spa. Soap making in Babylon was dangerous. Mixing lye and fat is a delicate balance. Too much ash, and you'd burn holes in the cloth. Too little, and you'd just be rubbing animal goop into already filthy fabric. Some formulas were so strong they caused chemical burns. And if you ever splashed fermented urine in your eye, well, enjoy temporary blindness and a new understanding of regret. And the worst part? It still didn't smell clean. There was no concept of citrus fresh or spring blossom. No suds, no foam, no cheerful squeak of rinsed cotton. Clean clothes smelled like hot rock, scorched meat, and maybe a whisper of stale vinegar. But in Babylonian terms, that was basically perfume. It's worth pausing here, not out of reverence, but maybe out of sheer astonishment that anyone survived laundry day with their dignity intact. Let that sink in. Ammonia, ash, and grease. This was your cleansing trifecta, and they took it seriously. Soap making was a craft. A volatile, foul-smelling, eye-watering craft. Those who did it well earned respect, or at least tolerance. Those who failed, they scorched garments, burned skin, and earned a reputation worse than a bad omen at a wedding. Laundry wasn't just labor, it was chemical warfare disguised as domestic duty. Now if you're wondering whether any of this left a legacy, it did. Babylonian soap recipes survived in cuneiform tablets, passed down like grandma's banana bread, but with more toxins. Even the Romans borrowed from them, famously taxing the collection of urine for their own public laundries. Innovation, it seems, has always smelled a little off. So the next time you pump a little liquid soap and marvel at how easy it all is, remember the ancient washerwoman squinting over her frothy vat of doom, ankle deep in a formula that could strip chrome off a chariot. She didn't get lemon zest, she got eye burn. But hey, her tunic came out looking slightly less cursed. So you've got your ancient soap, a toxic brew of ash, animal fat, and fermented pea. Delightful. Now what? You don't just dunk your tunic in it and hope for divine intervention. No, Babylonian laundry required something far more powerful than holy blessings or modern spin cycles. Feet.
Yes, human feet.
Your ancient washer's most valuable cleaning tool wasn't their hands, or their soap recipe, or even their patience. It was their calloused, sun-scorched, thoroughly abused feet. And those feet were about to do things you'll never look at the words gentle cycle the same way again. Here's how it worked. Once the garments were soaked in the aforementioned soap, they were thrown into giant vats, basically hollowed-out pits, or massive clay containers big enough to hold both fabric and a human or two. These vats were filled with hot water, preferably not the same water you fetched from the sewage canal that morning, but you know, compromises had to be made. The washer would climb in barefoot, step onto the cloth, and begin the process. The technical term, agitation. The real-world translation, stomping the ever-loving grime out of every inch of linen while slipping around in a broth of sweat, soap and mystery gunk. It wasn't just walking in place, it was a rhythm. A dance, a full-body exertion not unlike a cursed version of Riverdance where instead of applause, you got lower back pain and maybe cholera. This method wasn't unique to Babylon. Variations of the foot stomp technique were found in Egypt, Rome, and across ancient laundries for thousands of years. But Babylon took it seriously. The rhythm, the pressure, the hours spent, all mattered. Too much force and you tore the cloth, too little, and the dirt just soaked deeper in. You had to find the sweet spot between gentle enough to not destroy, and aggressive enough to remove goat blood. Visualize it. The sun is high, baking the mud brick walls around you. The air smells like a combination of ammonia, clay, and desperation. You're knee-deep in a tub, stomping tunics, like they insulted your mother. Your sweat mixes with the wash water, and you're fairly certain that thing floating by isn't a leaf. Meanwhile, a temple scribe watches from the shade, occasionally shouting corrections as if he's an expert in tunic stomping choreography. You'd think the process would be simple. Stomp, stomp, rinse, done. But no, there were stages, phases, rituals, even. First soak the garment, then stomp, then remove and scrub with a paddle, usually flat wood or stone. Then rinse, then stomp again. You repeated until the water turned from brown to slightly less brown, and the cloth stopped smelling like last week's sacrificial stew. And it wasn't just one person. Larger laundry operations used teams. Imagine a group of workers standing in a circle, stomping in sync, like a sweat-drenched drumline. Some would sing to keep rhythm, others just groaned in existential exhaustion. One stomped while another scrubbed. It was a team sport, a communal suffering, a bonding experience forged in soapy misery. If you were really unlucky, you got assigned to the winter shift. Imagine doing all of this in freezing mud, with numb toes and brittle cloth that cracked if you twisted too hard. Or the summer shift when the vats grew warm, the flies grew bold, and your skin cooked under the relentless sun. There were no good days, only degrees of bad. It's tempting to laugh at this, to write it off as primitive, inefficient, or even comical. But let's take a breath, because what we're really talking about here is labor. Unseen, physical, brutal labor. The kind done by people with no wealth, no voice, no escape. They worked so others could smell clean, look holy, or impress a guest. Their bodies became tools. Their suffering became background noise. So yeah, breathe that in. Dust and all. Even the tools weren't kind. The vats often had rough interiors. The paddles splintered. Soap got into cuts and eyes. You'd finish the day with shredded skin, swollen ankles, and the lingering scent of fermented lye in every pore. Oh, and let's not forget the health risks. Extended exposure to alkaline soap meant chemical burns were common. Combine that with unclean water and open wounds, and you've got the Babylonian version of employee benefits. And yet, the clothes came clean, or at least, cleaner. In a world where everything was covered in dust, sweat and religious anxiety, clean was a sliding scale. The stomped garments were lighter in color, less odorous, and carried a sense of renewal. You didn't just wash the cloth, you washed away the day, the mist of bad omens, maybe even the guilt. It's strangely poetic, isn't it? This primal act of stomping grime into clarity, using your own weight, your own pain, to restore something for someone else. A silent act of service, invisible, but indispensable. So next time your washer beeps and you grumble about folding, picture this: a barefoot Babylonian woman, standing in a soap-stained pit, stomping her way through someone else's sins while a fly buzzes past her face and the sun tries to peel her scalp. And just as she begins to rinse, just as she wrings the tunic with aching wrists, a goat eats it. Because of course it does. Let's set the scene. You're standing in the middle of Babylon's bustling marketplace, dodging ox carts, chicken feathers, and a questionable puddle of something that was definitely once alive. Around you, the crowd sways in linen waves, tunics, cloaks, headscarves, and the occasional fashion-forward attempt at a fringed belt. Welcome to Mesopotamian Fashion Week, circa 1800 BCE, where every outfit tells a story, usually one involving dust, divine favor, and how much barley you can afford to part with. Before we talk laundry, we need to talk wardrobe, because understanding what Babylonians wore is crucial to appreciating what they suffered to clean it. Spoiler, everything was beige, wrinkled, and smelled like warm goat, but let's pretend it had flair. The foundation of every Babylonian ensemble was the tunic. If you were a man, you wore it knee-length. If you were a woman, it went to your ankles. No zippers, no buttons, just a rectangular piece of fabric draped, wrapped and tied with something that vaguely resembled a belt. On a good day, it might be pleated. On a bad day, it was just damp. And what were these masterpieces made of? Primarily linen and wool. Linen came from flax plants, which sounds sustainable and Instagrammable until you realize that harvesting, drying, beating and spinning flax by hand is less coastal grandma aesthetic and more 18 hours of tendinitis. Once the fibers were finally twisted into thread, they were woven on vertical looms, operated by tired people with excellent posture and no air conditioning. Wool, meanwhile, came from sheep, and by extension from women who sheared, carded, spun, and loomed it into garments that smelled suspiciously like the sheep they came from. Wool was warm, durable, and far more forgiving when it came to hiding wine stain, which is why the elite often preferred it, despite its itch factor. Now here's the kicker. Clothes took weeks to make, sometimes months. Each piece was a product of hours upon hours of manual labor, passed from the hands of the farmer to the spinner to the weaver to the seamstress. There were no $5 t-shirts made by robots in fluorescent-lit factories. In Babylon, your closet was tiny, personal, and incredibly high stakes. So naturally, people wore their clothes until they fell apart, which is where laundry became both a necessity and a terrifying gamble. Imagine spending 40 hours weaving a tunic, only to have it mildewed in a wash pit, eaten by mold or mauled by a roaming goat. Imagine wringing it out and watching the thread snap like your will to live. Imagine explaining that to the woman who dyed it with crushed beetles for 3 days straight. Sorry, I over-soaked it doesn't quite cut it when your linen is now the texture of wet bread. And yet, people kept washing, kept risking it, because in a place where sweat was the default scent and dust was a permanent accessory, a clean tunic wasn't just a luxury, it was social armor. Looking clean meant looking respectable meant not getting accused of being cursed, sick, or a criminal. Babylonian logic was simple. If your hemline was stained, maybe your soul was too. Even color carried meaning. Natural dyes were painstaking to produce, and brighter hues like indigo or deep red signaled wealth or temple affiliation. So, when you washed these garments, you weren't just battling dirt, you were preserving your place in the cosmic social ladder. Bleed the dye, you lose status. Let it fade, you lose face. Let it shrink, you lose your job or work. There were also ceremonial garments, embroidered shawls for priestesses, ritual sashes for temple attendants, and heavily folded robes for those who had time to fold anything more than once a week. These were often reserved for festivals, sacrifices, or legal proceedings, and woe unto the launderer who damaged them. If your foot accidentally ripped a hem blessed by a high priest, you weren't just clumsy, you were inviting divine wrath, and possibly a fine. Even accessories had to be washed. Belts, veils, headbands, all susceptible to dirt, sweat, and the occasional errant fig. And don't even get started on sandals. Technically, they weren't washed per se, more like left in the sun and prayed over. But here's the subtle genius of Mesopotamian fashion. It was durable. Function came first. There were no corsets, no rhinestones, no woolen capes dragging in mud. Clothes were made to survive markets, temples, floods, dust storms, and the daily existential crisis of being a mortal in a city ruled by storm gods. If it couldn't handle foot-stomping laundry rituals and being beaten with a wooden paddle, it didn't belong in your wardrobe. Still, that didn't mean people didn't care about style. Quite the opposite. Hair was braided, beards were oiled and curled, jewelry, mostly bronze or shell, was worn proudly, and those with the means made sure their tunics had decorative stitching or fringed edges that said, "Yes, I do own a second pair of sandals. Thanks for noticing." Which brings us back to the wash. The pressure was enormous, because washing a Babylonian garment wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about preserving honor. The washer's job wasn't to make something look good. It was to keep something irreplaceable from dying in a vat of homemade soap. That was the line between survival and scandal. So ask yourself, would you spend 40 hours weaving a shirt just to let it mold in a wash pit? Because the people of Babylon did. Every day. And then they danced barefoot on it to make it clean. Let's be honest, the biggest difference between being rich and being poor in ancient Babylon wasn't just about how many goats you owned or how many gods you could afford to bribe. It was about who touched your underwear, or, more accurately, who had to wash. Because laundry, like most soul-crushing tasks in history, was a class issue. If you were wealthy, Laundry was something that simply happened in the background, like astrology or bread rising. You didn't wash your tunics. You didn't even see them washed. That was for servants, or slaves, or entire subclasses of people whose job it was to spend their waking hours ankle-deep in foot broth, scrubbing someone else's ceremonial sash while being yelled at for wrinkling the divine embroidery. Being wealthy meant never thinking about soap. It meant never touching your own bath water unless you were reclining in it. Your garments were taken from your body and spirited away like sacred relics, only to return later, lighter, cleaner, and occasionally missing a decorative bead, which you'd complain about for weeks. You might glance at the washer, but only with the mild disdain one reserves for fruit vendors who ask too many questions. And what did the poor get? Feet? Cold water? Possibly soap, if they could borrow it or make it from leftover fire ash and bacon grease. They didn't have servants, they were the servants. If they wanted clean clothes, they washed them by hand or foot themselves. If they were too busy to do it, or too tired or too old, then the tunic just stayed crusty until the smell became sentient and demanded its own bowl of barley gruel. Imagine this. Two men walk into a temple, one in spotless white linen that smells faintly of imported incense, the other in a sun-faded tunic with sweat patches that could tell time. One paid to have his clothing washed, while he relaxed on a cushion eating honeyed dates. The other washed his own cloak using ditch water and prayer, hoping no one noticed the mud streak shaped like a sandal. Laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a status symbol, and the washer folk were stuck in the middle. They didn't own the clothes they cleaned, but they knew them better than their owners did. They knew which priest's robe had a stubborn wine stain from the last festival, which merchant's tunic always reeked of fish oil, and which noble's linens came back bloodied once a month, and not from war. Their job was silent, invisible, and intimate. They touched what others wouldn't dare, and they were paid with scraps. Now, let's talk numbers. As thrilling as ancient economics can be, a washer for a wealthy household might receive food, shelter, and a tiny allowance, assuming they weren't enslaved, which, let's face it, they probably were. A freelance washer, on the other hand, someone doing laundry for multiple clients, might earn a few bronze shekels or some grain, enough to not die, not enough to afford soap that didn't peel skin. If you ruined a garment, well, if you were rich and your servant stained your tunic, you complained to your friends at the bathhouse and maybe beat the washer. If you were poor and ruined your only piece of clothing, you didn't have friends. You had a cloak made of regret and cabbage odor. And heaven help you if you were a washer who damaged an upper-class client's robe. That wasn't just bad service, that was a punishable offense. Laws from Mesopotamian codes. Yes, the same people who brought you an eye for an eye, often included fines or worse for damaging someone's property, especially clothing, because garments weren't just cloth, they were wealth, identity, evidence of power. So yes, laundry was warfare, class warfare, fought with lie, paddles, and silent resentment. Even access to water was divided by class. Wealthy households had private wells, or indoor basins. The poor carried water in clay pots from canals swarming with fish guts and waterborne diseases. If you had servants, you didn't just avoid the soap fat, you avoided the walk, the lifting, the exposure. Meanwhile, the poor risked illness and injury just to rinse a shirt. This is where things get a little more poetic if you squint hard enough, because despite the grinding inequality, there was something universal about laundry. Everyone needed it. Rich, poor, priest, merchant, drunkard yelling at goats. Everyone had to face the dirt eventually. And in that dirt, there was something uncomfortably equalizer. Stain didn't care if you were blessed by Marduk or cursed by your in-laws. A sweaty armpit was a sweaty armpit, divine destiny be damned. And sometimes, rarely, the rich did get their hands dirty, in mourning, during penance, on festival days when symbolic purification was required, just for a moment. A noble might kneel beside a washer and touch the very vat they'd ignored their whole life. They wouldn't stomp, of course. Gods know, but they'd place a finger in the soap and nod sagely, as if they understood struggle. They didn't, but the washer folk did. Every stain they scrubbed was a reminder of someone else's comfort. Every tunic they stomped was a robe they'd never wear. Every rinse was an act of survival. Which brings us to a question that still lingers in the wash. What happened if you accidentally ruined your master's linen? Spoiler, you didn't do it twice. Let's say you're an average Babylonian with no house servants, no personal washer, and no desire to spend your precious hours stomping your own tunic in fermented goat pee. What do? Simple. You head to the public laundry zone, Babylon's version of a drop-off service, minus the detergent pods, and plus a whole lot of mud, chaos, and aggressive ducks. Yes, the city had communal washing areas. No, they weren't glamorous. Think less spa-like river retreat, and more open-air mosh pit with buckets. These spaces were carved out along riverbanks, near wells, or around shared cisterns where water, already a rare commodity in Mesopotamia, could be pooled and weaponized against centuries of grime. Picture the scene. At dawn, the public laundry zone comes alive. People arrive with bundles of dirty linen slung over shoulders, tucked under arms, or balanced precariously on heads. Children trail behind carrying pots of water or clinging to a sandal. Dogs bark, chickens flee. The air is a humid cocktail of soap fumes, body odor, canal algae, and that special kind of mildew only achievable in the hundred. Welcome to Babylon's laundromat. But unlike today's sterile, fluorescent, coin-operated serenity, this was a social circus. People didn't just come to clean their clothes. They came to exchange news, air grievances, spy on neighbors, and low-key judge tunic stains. You couldn't exactly scroll your clay tablet feed, so the laundry zone became the de facto gossip hub. And the rumors? Hotter than the stones lining the riverbank. So I hear Nabu's wife is pregnant again. And not by Nabu. It's incredible how much dirt can come out in the wash, and how much can get stirred up between rinse cycles. At the center of it all, the washer folk. Some were freelancers. Others worked as part of family units or guilds. A few had regular clients who dropped off their garments like ancient dry cleaning, no tickets, no receipts, just trust and mild panic. These pros would organize the piles, sort by urgency or spiritual significance, and get to work barefoot, sunburned, and serenaded by the sounds of grumbling donkeys and passive-aggressive haggling. Their equipment? Buckets, vats, soap mixtures in clay jars and feet, always the feet. But the challenge wasn't just the dirt, it was the environment. Public wash zones were open to the elements, meaning dust storms, animal interference, and the occasional flash flood could absolutely ruin a day's work. There was no roof, no walls, and no such thing as a do not disturb sign. If a goat wandered through your drying linens, that was your problem. If someone's child slipped and kicked a soap pot into the canal, congratulations, you now had a front row seat to a very loud public argument. Security was also an issue. Clothes left to dry could, and often did, go missing. Theft was rampant. A nice wool tunic, even slightly damp, was a tempting prize. Some washerfolk tried marking items with knots or bits of colored thread. Others just memorized every item and prayed to Ishtar that no one walked off with a ceremonial sash. And yet, despite the chaos, these places functioned. People knew the rhythm. They respected the invisible boundaries. Newcomers were sized up with a glance, judged on the quality of their tunic, the stench of their wash water, and whether they brought bribes in the form of dried dates or small gossip offerings. It was a delicate balance of service and shade. Interestingly, there was also an element of ritual here. Some garments required spiritual cleansing, not just physical, so you'd see people muttering prayers as they rinsed, or sprinkling holy water, read slightly cleaner canal water, over a tunic meant for temple use. Laundry wasn't just maintenance. Sometimes it was penance, and sometimes it was rebellion. A widow refusing to use her late husband's family washerwoman might publicly clean her clothes as a statement. A priest caught laundering his own undergarments might be hiding something like humility, or a mistress. A merchant who arrived with too many robes for a single person, possibly a front for laundering more than just clothes. The ancient world had its secrets, and a lot of them dripped dry in plain sight. Water management was crucial. The washers organized their work near the best access points, wells, cisterns, or irrigation canals diverted for just long enough to fill a few vats. In drier seasons, fights broke out. Not metaphorical ones, literal screaming, bucket-throwing brawls over who got first rights to the clean water. Babylonian cities didn't just manage water with laws, they managed it with a healthy amount of yelling. But occasionally, miraculously, things settled. The sun would dip low, shadows stretched across the stone, the washers scrubbed in rhythm, The river lapped lazily, a breeze carried the scent of soap and reeds. For a brief moment, there was peace, community, an understanding that everyone, rich, poor, broken, blessed, was united in the grimy, foamy business of trying to look slightly less awful than yesterday. And then someone's goat peed in the rinse vat. Still, these public laundry spots remained a backbone of daily life. They were loud, chaotic, and occasionally disgusting, but they were also dependable, functional, and deeply human. You didn't just drop off laundry, you entered a system, one held together by calloused hands, hardened rules, and the collective desire not to smell like last week's fermented barley stew. So next time you stroll into a pristine laundromat, Bluetooth earbuds in, scrolling through memes while your socks spin in silence, remember the Babylonian wash zone, because behind every clean tunic was a public stage, a human drama, and a woman squinting at a suspicious stain, wondering if it was wine, blood, or bad decisions. Let's take a break from the visual for a moment and talk about something far more haunting, the smell. The real Babylonian experience wasn't just what you saw, it was what hit your nostrils like a divine slap to the soul. You didn't stroll through the streets of ancient Babylon, you waded through a cloud of aromas so thick you could chew them. Now to be fair, not everything stank. The occasional whiff of incense from a temple, a fresh date loaf pulled from a fire pit, or the sweet sap of cypress trees. Yes, those existed, but these were fleeting moments of nasal mercy. The rest was a festival of filth. Picture it, fish guts from the Euphrates, sun-ripened manure, human sweat fermented under 3 layers of linen, and the constant undertone of ash and river rot. It was less pleasant scentscape and more punch in the olfactory cortex. And in the middle of all this funk, laundry. So what did clean laundry smell like in Babylon? Let's start with what it didn't smell like. Lavender, lemongrass, sea breeze, or anything on the modern candle aisle. There was no such thing as synthetic fragrance. Clean didn't mean floral and calming. Clean meant less disgusting than it was an hour ago. A successful wash ended with garments that didn't reek of feet and panic. If you sniffed your tunic and merely wrinkled your nose instead of dry heaving, that was a win. The base scent of a freshly laundered Babylonian tunic would have been complicated. Think boiled wool, soap made of urine and ash, sun-baked fabric, and whatever lingering notes the water supply contributed. Algae, fish scales, or the whisper of a drowned frog. Add in the staleness of foot-stomping sweat and you have a scent profile best described as earthy anguish. And yet, this was better than the alternative. Because the alternative was the everyday bouquet of unwashed humanity. Imagine a city where most people bathe once a month, if that, and own maybe 2 outfits, both of which double as sleepwear. The hot season didn't just bring heat, it brought waves of BO so thick they could be mapped. Let that sink in. So when someone walked by wearing a garment that didn't cause birds to flee, it was a statement. I care. I have a washer. I am slightly less revolting than everyone else. In this world, scent was status. If you smelled neutral, not good, just neutral, you had made it. But for those with means, there were ways to elevate your olfactory game. Babylonian elites didn't just stop at soap, they layered. Perfumed oils made from pressed flowers, exotic resins, and spices were dabbed onto robes or skin. Myrrh, frankincense, and cedarwood were popular, not just for religious offerings, but for body odor suppression. Imagine slathering yourself in incense paste, just to mask the fact that you hadn't changed socks in 3 weeks. Some garments were even stored with aromatic herbs, crushed juniper, or dried mint, in an attempt to absorb the ambient awfulness. Was it effective? Marginally. Did it make you feel superior to your goat-washing neighbor? Absolutely. Now, let's talk about how smell influenced society. You could tell someone's job by their scent. Fishermen smelled like fish. Dyers smelled like minerals and sulfur. Priests smelled like incense and sweat-soaked wool. And washerfolk? They smelled like a bizarre mix of ammonia, damp cloth, and crushed ego. It was a badge of the working class, worn with pride, exhaustion, and maybe just a tinge of despair. But it wasn't just occupational. Smell could betray secrets. Affairs were sniffed out, literally. A woman returning from a forbidden lover's house might reek of unfamiliar perfume or strange incense. Suspicious husbands became amateur olfactory detectives, Children caught sneaking temple wine could be sniffed out by the scent of sacred oil. Even legal testimony sometimes referenced smell. He stank of the river at midnight was not poetic flair, it was evidence. Smell also had religious implications. Ritual purity required not just physical cleanliness, but olfactory neutrality. Garments used in temple service had to be free of offensive odors. If your robe still smelled like last night's feast, you weren't just unclean, you were spiritually compromised. The gods apparently had noses. This leads us to an uncomfortable truth. Babylonian hygiene was less about comfort and more about cosmic order. Washing your clothes wasn't just practical, it was moral. Letting them fester wasn't just lazy, it was suspicious, maybe even criminal. A poorly washed tunic might signal disease, poverty, or heresy. It was like walking around with a sign that read, "Approach with caution," probably cursed. And yet, people adapted. They learned how to blend in, cover up, or embrace the funk. Some washed more frequently than others. Some doused themselves in incense smoke. Some just stopped caring. Because in a city of 100,000 sweating humans, you eventually go nose-blind, but not the washer folk. Their noses were weapons, trained, attuned, merciless. They could identify a rotting hem at 10 paces, detect mildew hidden beneath folds, sense the exact moment a tunic crossed from salvageable to burn it in a pit and start over. Their work was not just physical, it was sensory warfare. So next time you do laundry and catch the scent of fresh linen, close your eyes. Breathe deep. Imagine identifying class by aroma. Ah yes, a man of the barley caste. And last week's socks, that was Babylon. A world where scent could exalt you or expose you. If you think laundry today is a soul-draining task that exists only to remind you of your own futility, you're not wrong, but at least it's secular futility. In ancient Babylon, laundry wasn't just a chore, it was ritual, a sacred dance between dirt and divinity, a sudsy communion with the gods, with far higher stakes than wrinkled sheets. Because in Mesopotamia, cleanliness wasn't merely about hygiene, it was spiritual order. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was disorder. It was the physical manifestation of chaos. And laundry, that was the act of restoring cosmic balance, one soaked tunic at a time. Let's start with the temples. Religious garments were the haute couture of Babylon, ornate, symbolic, and dangerously meaningful. They weren't just worn, they were consecrated, and when these garments got dirty, whether by blood, oil, incense smoke, or, spontaneous divine spillage, you didn't just chuck them into the nearest wash pit, you performed a ritual cleansing. Picture this. A high priestess stands beneath the rising sun holding a silk-stitched robe above a basin of holy water, or at least slightly filtered canal sludge. Around her, junior temple servants chant incantations copied from cuneiform tablets, older than anyone present. The water is poured, the cloth is submerged. A goat bleats nearby for no clear reason. The robe isn't just being cleaned, it's being purified. Because to wear a garment in service of a god meant that garment had to be spiritually sound. If it carried traces of impurity, sin, illness, or that weird wine you shouldn't have drunk during the eclipse, it could offend the deity. And nobody wanted to be the reason Marduk had a temper tantrum. That's how floods happen. These rituals varied by temple, region, and available goat budget, but the underlying belief was the same. Clean clothes meant clean souls, and clean souls meant divine favor, which, in ancient Mesopotamia, was essential as food, water, or a functioning roof that didn't collapse mid-sermon. Now, for the average Babylonian, the stakes were slightly lower. Most people didn't have sacred tunics or access to temple lie, but they did believe in omens, curses, and spiritual contamination. If you walked through a haunted site, argued with a demon-possessed neighbor, or accidentally saw something you weren't supposed to, guess what? Your clothes absorbed that energy, and so you washed. Not because you were sweaty, but because your shirt had bad vibes. This is where things get interesting. Because ritual laundering wasn't always performed by the wearer. Sometimes, you brought your cursed tunic to a professional. Not just any washer, a purifying washer. Someone trained in both laundry and low-level exorcism. They didn't just stomp your robe, they chanted over it. They didn't just rinse, they invoked protective deities. The result, a slightly damp garment, and the spiritual equivalent of a sage cleanse. Let that sink in. You could pay someone to stomp the demons out of your socks. Of course, this came at a price. Ritual laundering wasn't cheap. The purifying washer needed compensation, usually in barley, silver, or a symbolic offering like a feather or bead. In return, you received a garment that no longer carried the spiritual residue of last week's poor life choices. Or at least you believed it didn't, which frankly was often enough. This belief extended to death, too. When someone died, their garments were washed before burial or cremation, not just for hygiene, but to symbolically separate the soul from the physical world. Imagine washing the final tunic of a loved one, knowing it would never be worn again, every fold scrubbed, every fiber rinsed, not just out of duty, but out of reverence. And in this, laundry became grief, a gentle ritual of farewell. Even childbirth had its laundering rituals. New mothers, seen as ritually impure for a period after birth, had to cleanse both themselves and their clothing before re-entering society. The garments worn during labor were often burned or buried, but if washed, they were handled only by specialists. Because nothing says congratulations like having your maternity gown spiritually detoxed. And of course there were festivals. During major religious holidays, people washed their finest garments in preparation for temple processions. It wasn't just about looking nice. It was about showing respect to the gods, to the priests, to the ancestral spirits who were presumably watching from the ceiling like judgmental pigeons. A stained sash on Ishtar's feast day? Practically a crime. Even the act of hanging laundry had spiritual overtones. Some people believed the wind could carry away evil spirits clinging to damp clothes. So drying wasn't just drying, it was an act of renewal. An open invitation for cosmic spring cleaning. You'd stretch your robe across a line, whisper a prayer, and let the gods take it from there, literally and metaphysically. Modern comparison? Like dry cleaning your Sunday best, but with goat sacrifices and a side of existential dread. And yet, it wasn't all solemnity. Ritual didn't mean joyless. There was beauty in the repetition, in the care, in the moment of stillness, as water poured over cloth. In a chaotic, dusty, often brutal world, these quiet rituals offered something rare: control. You couldn't change fate, but you could at least scrub your tunic before meeting it. So the next time you toss a robe into the wash without so much as a whisper to the heavens, remember, in Babylon, that would have been heresy, and possibly how your neighbor's house caught fire. Laundry, as we've seen, was never just laundry in ancient Babylon. It was work, ritual, survival, and occasionally a complete and utter catastrophe. Because when your entire wardrobe consists of one tunic, and it takes half a season to make another, a botched wash isn't an inconvenience. It's a life event, a personal apocalypse, a soap-slicked tragedy with witnesses. Let's begin with a classic: fabric tears. Ancient linen and wool weren't woven in high-tech factories. They were hand-spun, hand-woven, hand-everything, which meant they were also hand-fragile. Years of wear, exposure to sun, and the occasional goat nibble made them prone to sudden rips, especially when subjected to the ancient washer's foot stomp method. One careless step and kirk, there goes the hemline. And if it happened to a priest's robe, you might as well start digging your own disciplinary pit. But tears weren't the only peril. Dye runs were the silent killers of ancient laundry day. Babylonian garments were often dyed with crushed plants, minerals and insects. Gorgeous, painstaking colors that bled like a skinned plum the second they met. Hot water. If you tossed a crimson sash into the same vat as a ceremonial white tunic, you didn't get art. You got evidence. Evidence that you, personally, ruined a robe worth more than your yearly barley ration. And it wasn't just the washer's fault. Sometimes the owners were the problem. Oh yes, it's color-fast, they'd say, handing you a robe dyed with imported lapis. The priest said it was blessed. Well, congratulations. The priest didn't mention that blessed garments bleed just as quickly as unblessed ones. And now the rinse water looks like a murder scene. Enjoy explaining that to the temple steward. Then there were the disappearances. Yes, clothes went missing, and not always because of theft. In public wash areas, a tunic could simply vanish, carried away by the wind, mistakenly picked up by someone else, dragged off by a goat with an expensive taste in linen. There's even one recorded case, on a badly preserved clay tablet, of a washerwoman accusing her rival of intentionally misplacing a sash during a festival week, Scholars can't confirm if this was sabotage or sass, but we can confirm someone got yelled at in front of a lot of very uncomfortable scribes. And let's not forget, shrinking. You know that panic when your favorite sweater comes out 2 sizes too small. Imagine that feeling. But your life depends on that sweater fitting correctly at a fertility rite. Babylonian fabrics could shrink if washed in water that was too hot, or if dried too quickly in the desert sun. A tunic shrunk by just a few inches could render it unwearable, not because of vanity, but because certain cuts and lengths carried symbolic meaning. Too short, and your status or modesty might be questioned. Now imagine this scenario. A young washerboy, eager to prove himself, takes charge of a nobleman's robes. He uses fresh ash soap, rinses diligently, stomps with enthusiasm. All seems well. The robes dry, crisp, and clean. But by morning, the nobleman is red-faced and shouting, his prestigious gold-threaded trim has unraveled. Why? Because the washer didn't know that decorative gold thread can weaken in alkaline solutions. The robe is ruined, the boy is whipped. And somewhere in the distance, a goat eats a sandal. It's always the goats. Then there were the emotional disasters, the ones that left scars even when the fabric survived. Picture a washerwoman cleaning a widow's final garment, the last tunic her husband wore before passing into the underworld. She scrubs with care, murmuring prayers, only to watch in horror as the fabric tears in half mid-rinse. She gasps. The widow weeps. And the tunic, meant to be buried as a token of love, dissolves like old paper. It's not just cloth, it's memory, and it's... Even the gods weren't safe from washroom accidents. During festival seasons, temple garments had to be spotless. The slightest stain or damage could disrupt ceremonies. One ancient myth, part ritual, part cautionary tale, tells of a washer who allowed a sacred robe to dry too close to a cooking fire. The hem singed. The robe was deemed impure. The ceremony was cancelled. Crops failed. The gods were displeased. Was it actually because of the robe? Who knows? But the washer was banished, and the tale survived, mostly as a warning to keep holy clothes away from flames, dogs, and your cousin with the clumsy elbows. And all of this unfolded in a world where forgiveness was limited, and fabric was currency. You couldn't just apologize for a washroom mishap. You made reparations. You replaced the garment. You repented. Sometimes you paid with your labor. Sometimes your freedom. Sometimes, if the robe belonged to the wrong person at the wrong time, you simply disappeared, much like the tunic you lost. Still watching? Then you clearly don't mind a little dirt. Or drama. Like, subscribe and don't leave your tunic unattended. The truth is, Babylonian laundry wasn't a gentle process. It was violent, alchemical, full of risk and ruin. For every perfectly folded ceremonial robe, there were 10 quietly shredded tunics buried in shame behind a washhouse. Every stain that came out was a victory. Every garment returned intact was a miracle. So next time your laundry shrinks, bleeds, or vanishes entirely, take a breath. You're standing in a long, stained tradition. Let's talk about crime, not the grand empire-toppling kind. No assassinations, no stolen tablets of law, no dramatic temple betrayals. No, this is about laundry theft. Petty, pitiful, profoundly irritating. Because in ancient Babylon, one of the most quietly devastating things that could happen to you, short of being possessed by a demon, or fined for spitting in the wrong canal, was having your freshly washed tunic stolen while it was still damp. It sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But it happened. You have to understand, clothing wasn't replaceable back then. You didn't just pop over to Babylonian Target and grab a 3-pack of tunics with reinforced seams and extra breathability. A single garment could take weeks to make, from harvesting flax or shearing seif to spinning, weaving, and sewing. And once you had it, you wore it until it gave up the will to exist. So when someone walked off with your only clean tunic, they weren't just committing petty theft. They were stealing your identity, your labor, your sense of basic bodily dignity. Public wash zones, as we've seen, were chaotic free-for-alls. Loud, busy, and poorly supervised. Garments dried on low stone walls, tree limbs, makeshift ropes strung between broken columns. No tags, no labels, just a sea of beige rectangles fluttering in the breeze, and in that beige chaos, Someone could easily snatch a sash, a scarf, or even a full tunic without drawing attention. Some thieves were subtle, blending into the crowd, folding a damp robe over their arm like it belonged to them. Others were more theatrical, shouting about how my brother asked me to fetch this, while sprinting toward an alleyway, sandals flapping. Then there were the professionals. Yes, professional tunic thieves. People who roamed wash zones, specifically to steal garments, either to resell them in another part of the city, or to trade for food, tools, or a better-fitting outfit. Clothes were currency, soft, crumpled, occasionally lice-infested currency. Naturally, this led to precautions. Some launderers marked clothes with unique knots, stitches, or symbols scratched into tiny clay tokens tied to garments with twine. Others painted initials using red dye or carved discreet slashes into hems. An early form of branding that said, "Yes, this sweaty undergarment belongs to me, and I'd prefer not to see it on your cousin next week." But not everyone was so careful. Which brings us to one particularly tragicomic tale, preserved in part on a damaged cuneiform tablet from Sippar, a city north of Babylon. The tablet, fragmentary and worn, describes a man named Belidin who sent his only ceremonial cloak to a public wash zone before an important religious procession. It was white wool with gold thread fringe, very fashionable, very expensive, very gold. The cloak disappeared while drying. Chaos ensued. Belidin arrived to collect his cloak, only to be handed a damp tunic that smelled vaguely of fermented onions and had a suspicious tomato-colored stain. He protested, loudly. The washer insisted. That's what he'd dropped off. A crowd gathered. Voices rose. Threats were made. A goat panicked and knocked over a soap vat. Belidin, humiliated, was forced to attend the procession in an undershirt and borrowed shawl. His name, according to the rest of the tablet, was later stricken from the procession record due to inappropriate attire. This was the ancient equivalent of being turned away from the Met Gala because someone else wore your outfit and you had to show up in a bathrobe. Clothing mattered. Theft mattered. And the consequences rippled outward. Sometimes, stolen garments ended up in entirely different cities. A trader might pick up a bundle of lost laundry, rebrand it as foreign luxury, and sell it back to the same class of people it was stolen from. The irony was rarely lost, unless, of course, the original owner recognized a familiar wine stain or frayed neckline. And punishment? Well, that depended on your status. If a poor person stole from another poor person, it might result in a fistfight or public shaming, maybe a symbolic slap with a sandal. If someone stole from the wealthy, they risked arrest, fines, or worse. Babylonian legal codes were nothing if not thorough. And yes, they included rules about clothing theft. Some penalties involved repaying the garment's value several times over, often in silver. Others involved lashes. In extreme cases, particularly if the stolen item was sacred, the thief could be imprisoned or expelled from their guild, which, in Babylon, was basically career death. And let's not forget the accidental thieves. The honest mistakes. The "I thought this was mine" scenarios. These could be socially fatal, mistakenly taking someone else's garment, especially if they outranked you, could spark weeks of gossip, ruined reputations, and awkward encounters in temple courtyards. Imagine showing up to market in a tunic identical to the one worn by the town scribe, only he's glaring at you like you just stole his lunch and his girlfriend. Anecdote time. There's a story, passed down more as urban legend than verified history, of a man who lost his only cloak and had to attend a temple offering in a towel. Not metaphorically, an actual towel. Apparently he emerged from the wash pit, reached for his drying robe, gone, in its place, a reed mat and a growing sense of doom. He wrapped himself in the nearest cloth, a towel used for scrubbing donkeys, marched to temple, and stood in line like nothing was wrong. People whispered, priests stared, a child pointed and asked, "Is that the sacrifice?" Chaos ensued. Again. So yes, laundry theft in Babylon was real. It was annoying. It was embarrassing. And occasionally it was hilarious. But most of all, it was human. Because even in one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, with ziggurats scraping the sky and laws chiseled in stone, people still fought over socks. So, your laundry's been stomped, rinsed, and wrung out with the fury of 10 generations. It smells like slightly less death than it did an hour ago. Congratulations! You've survived the ancient Babylonian wash cycle. But now comes the final act in this long, humid odyssey, drying. And oh, what an act it is. Drying clothes in Babylon wasn't just about draping them over a rock and hoping for the best. It was a delicate game of timing, sunlight, wind, and luck. A ritual in its own right, minus the goats. Okay, not really. The goats still showed up. The Babylonian sun was your primary tool, and also your worst enemy. On one hand, it baked garments dry in record time. On the other, it turned delicate linen into brittle parchment if you left it out too long. Set your tunic on the wall at noon. Forget it for an hour, and boom, you now owned a sun-toasted toga crispier than a sacrificial flatbread. So where did people dry clothes? Anywhere they could. Rooftops were ideal. Flat, sun-drenched, and just high enough to discourage thieves and passing goats. Mud brick walls made excellent impromptu racks. So did tree branches, collapsed ziggurat steps, and the occasional friendly neighbor's fence. Some homes even had dedicated drying posts, forked sticks jammed into the ground like the world's saddest laundry sculpture garden. For those lucky enough to be near a river, stones along the bank were a popular choice. The heat of the sun-warmed rock helped speed up the drying process, though it came with the occasional surprise lizard or muddy paw print. If your drying cloth got trampled by a passing ox, well, that was a conversation for later, likely loud, and mostly involving insults about your family's dyeing skills. Now here's where it gets strangely poetic. Drying was a moment of peace, for a few brief minutes or hours, depending on your local wind situation. You didn't have to stomp, scrub, or wring. You simply laid the cloth out, watched it flutter in the breeze, and prayed that it wouldn't blow away, burst into flames, or get pooped on by one of the many gods' winged emissaries, pigeons. And of course it often did get pooped on, because Babylonian skies were full of birds, doves, cranes, sparrows, and that one cursed raven that seemed to aim only for ceremonial garments. There's no word in Akkadian for targeted aerial assault, but based on archaeological sarcasm, they must have had one. Humorous beat. Did a bird poop on this tunic, or is that ancient art? Then there was the wind. Oh, the wind. That dry, relentless whisper of the desert that carried both the scent of roasting onions and the constant threat of garment relocation. You'd secure your tunic with a clay weight or a stone, step away to check on the soap pot, and when you turned back, your laundry was gone, carried off like a sacrificial offering to the god of inconvenience. Some people tried to tie down their garments with ropes or weave reeds into makeshift pegs. Others simply assigned a child or a low-ranking apprentice to stand guard, an honor only slightly less prestigious than latrine cleaner. The watchperson's job was to swat away birds, fend off curious goats, and yell if anything tried to blow away, get eaten, or catch fire. Yes, fire. In Babylon, drying laundry too close to a cooking hearth or incense stand could end in smoldering disaster. Imagine explaining to a high priest why his ceremonial loincloth now resembles a grilled cabbage leaf. Not ideal, but amid the chaos and fire hazards, there was something almost spiritual about drying. The sun, for all its scorching aggression, was also sacred. Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god, was a figure of justice, purity, and illumination, literally and metaphorically. To lay a garment under his gaze was to expose it to divine scrutiny. Letting your robe dry in sunlight was a kind of offering, a quiet prayer for clarity, for renewal, for maybe not getting yelled at today. Some even whispered blessings over their drying clothes. Not because the gods needed to hear it, but because it made you feel like you had a tiny bit of control. Like maybe if you said the right words and angled your tunic just so, the stains would stay gone, the fibers would stay strong, and the bird above wouldn't relieve itself out of spite. And then came the dust. Always the dust. Just when your linen was perfectly dry, soft, warm, glowing with the approval of the heavens, a sudden gust would kick up half the road and sprinkle it across your work, like the world's most disrespectful spice blend. You'd pick up your garment, pat it down, and sigh, because what else could you do? Dust was Babylon's version of inevitability, like death, or taxes, or your cousin showing up uninvited to dinner with 5 new kids and no explanation. Still, there were victories. Moments when the drying went right, when the sun cooperated, when the birds abstained, when the breeze was gentle, the cloth was smooth, and the garment folded over your arm like a blessing. You'd carry it home, or to your client with a small sense of triumph. The wash was done. The tunic lived to see another day. So yes, drying clothes in Babylon was a gamble. A dusty, windy, occasionally flammable gamble. But it was also a moment of stillness in a world that rarely stopped moving. And sometimes, just sometimes, that moment was enough. Let's address the steaming, sweat-soaked elephant in the room. Who actually did all this laundry? Who stomped the tunics? Who brewed the soap from bodily fluids and fire ash? Who spent their waking hours hunched over clay vats while someone else got credit for looking respectable in a wrinkle-free robe? Spoiler, it wasn't the guys in gold-trimmed sashes reclining under palm fronds. In ancient Babylon, as in most ancient civilizations, laundry was deeply gendered. Washing clothes, like spinning thread, kneading bread, and raising children who didn't fall into wells, was largely the domain of women, not always by choice, not often by thanks. The domestic sphere was female territory, and laundry fell squarely within its dusty, back-breaking borders. Whether you were a mother, daughter, servant, or enslaved woman, chances are high you spent part of your life scrubbing someone else's sweat out of fabric while pretending the soap didn't sting your open blisters. But don't mistake this for simple domesticity. Babylonian women weren't gently humming while washing a small basket of delicates by moonlight. They were industrial laborers operating without gloves, without breaks, and without so much as a thank you. The tunic no longer smells like fermented camel. They worked in groups, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes in family units, sometimes in temple guilds, often in hierarchies so rigid they could make a priest blush. Older women taught younger girls the rhythms of the wash, how to soak without wasting water, how to stomp without tearing fabric, how to spot a cursed stain from 20 paces. It wasn't just knowledge, it was inheritance. Skills passed down through calloused hands and gritted teeth. And make no mistake, this was power. Quiet, sweaty, behind-the-scenes power. Because while men scribbled laws into clay and shouted about omens, it was women who made sure they didn't smell like a compost heap when doing it. Priests in spotless robes? Thank a woman. Merchants in fragrant linen? Thank a woman. Kings anointed in gleaming wool? Definitely thank the woman who boiled goat fat and ash until the royal drawers were pristine. Still, women's laundry work was invisible, until something went wrong. If a tunic shrank, her fault. If the dye bled, her fault. If the ceremonial sash came back one tassel short because a pigeon got involved, still her fault. There were exceptions, of course. Some men participated in laundry work, especially in larger public wash operations, or when ritual purification was involved. These were often temple servants or lower-class laborers, and while rare, some male washers made names for themselves. Literally, their names show up in receipts, on contracts, even in the occasional passive-aggressive temple memo. Returned late, still damp, see Nasir about soap usage. But male washers were the exception, not the rule. And their presence in no way erased the overwhelming reality. Laundry was women's work. It was expected, it was enforced, and it was often used to reinforce power structures within the home, the temple, and society at large. A mother who taught her daughter to wash garments properly was considered virtuous. A wife who kept her husband's robe spotless earned praise in songs and proverbs. A daughter-in-law who failed at laundry, oh, she'd hear about it, from everyone. Loudly, until she either got it right or mysteriously end up back with her parents. Yet beneath the societal expectations, laundry also offered rare moments of feminine autonomy. Out at the wash zone, away from the constant surveillance of husbands, fathers and priests, women talked. They gossiped, they vented, they shared stories and secrets, and quiet, grim laughter. It was a microcosm of female solidarity, a space where power, however small, was reclaimed one soap-soaked tunic at a time. Was doing laundry a punishment, or a private moment of peace? It depended. For some, it was drudgery. For others, it was routine. For a few, especially those employed by temples or wealthy households, it could be a profession, a way to earn food, coin, or stability. And, for enslaved women, it was a sentence, labor without choice, without rest, and often without hope. But even within those bleak walls there were moments. Moments where a washer paused, squeezed water from a robe, and stood in the sun for one heartbeat longer than necessary. Moments where two women locked eyes and understood something without speaking. Moments where the mundane became something almost sacred. The gender divide extended to perception too. Men who washed their own clothes, unless it was part of a religious ritual, were considered suspect. Too poor, too low status, too strange. A man doing his own laundry was like a goat, quoting poetry. Possible, but deeply unsettling to the societal order. And yet, in times of hardship, famine, war, mass illness, the roles blurred. Everyone had to adapt. There are records of wounded soldiers laundering their own bandages, widowers scrubbing blood from funeral robes, and even high priests washing vestments after a fire destroyed the temple's purification chambers. In those moments, laundry wasn't gendered. It was just necessary. So yes, Babylonian laundry was a woman's world. Built from necessity, maintained by tradition, bound by expectations, yet quietly rebellious. Because every stomp, every rinse, every sun-dried robe was an act of survival, and sometimes of defiance. It was power folded into cloth, one wash at a time. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how committed the ancient Babylonians were to not smelling like the inside of a sweaty sandal. Not only did they invent laundry jobs, communal wash zones, and a foot-stomping workout routine that would put your yoga instructor in traction, they also wrote their soap recipes down. Yes, someone in 200 BCE sat hunched over a clay tablet and thought future generations must know how to make my lye-stuffed stink paste. And you know what? They were right. Thanks to scribes with too much access to goat fat and not enough scented candles, we actually have preserved records of ancient Mesopotamian soap-making instructions, cuneiform and all. You could practically make a Babylonian detergent starter kit if you didn't mind your hands smelling like roasted barley and sadness. Let's break one of these bad boys down, shall we? Picture this. You squint at a wedge-shaped cuneiform tablet excavated near a ruined ziggurat. It's cracked, slightly burned, because of course it is, and labelled with what roughly translates to recipe for softening oils and cleaning garments. So far, so promising. Now here's what it tells us. Step 1. Collect your ingredients. And by ingredients, we don't mean anything remotely pleasant. You're going to need animal fat, probably sheep or goat, rendered down into a thick, greasy slop. Delicious. Then you need alkaline salts, typically pulled from dried lake beds or evaporated brine. These crusty white deposits were scooped up in baskets, sifted by hand, and definitely not tested for purity. Just throw them in and hope they don't burn a hole through your linen. Then comes the lye ash. Ah yes, made by burning wood. Collecting the ashes, and then boiling those ashes with water to extract a potent, skin-blistering liquid. Think of it as liquid soap's deeply unhinged ancestor. You didn't test it with pH strips, you tested it with your fingers once. Optional additions? Crushed cypress needles, barley husks, or mashed figs for exfoliation, or maybe for cursing. No one's quite sure, but they were definitely included, which says a lot about ancient tolerance for discomfort. Step 2. Cook it, all of it, together. In a big clay pot over a fire that may or may not also be roasting the family's dinner. Stir for hours, let it cool. Stir again. What you're left with is a sticky gelatinous sludge that bubbles ever so slightly and smells like the inside of a blacksmith's apron. This was the good stuff. It didn't lather much, or at all, but it got the grease out of wool and the fish guts out of tunics. It could double as a floor scrubber or an insect repellent, and when times were tough, it may have also served as shampoo, though that's more speculation. No tablet says rub this into your scalp unless you hate yourself. Now let's imagine if Babylon had TikTok. Cue Iltani, ancient influencer and high priest's niece, standing in her reed-roofed courtyard with a ring of palm ash in one hand and a smirk on her face. Hey soap scribes, welcome back to another Cleanse the Sin tutorial. Today, I'm making my favourite all-natural linen clarifier, straight from the river gods themselves. You'll need goat tallow, 3 pinches of ghost salt, and a generous splash of that delicious fermented fig juice you've been hoarding under your stairs. Blessed by Shamash, no more pit stains. You laugh? But this was a serious science back then. Soap making required precise ratios, careful timing, and a stomach strong enough to stir boiling animal fat at noon in 100 boofed heat. Get the mix wrong, and your linen would melt. or your skin would blister, or your boss would demand a refund, and you'd get docked half a barley ration for the week. And yet, they wrote it down. That's the part worth pausing for. Because when civilizations write recipes, they're doing more than preserving knowledge. They're codifying labor, making the invisible visible, giving status to the people, mostly women who did this messy, exhausting, and thankless work every day, one wedge mark at a time. It also hints at something bigger, the desire for control. In a world of unpredictable floods, vengeful gods, and deadly toothaches, soap was a tiny act of agency, a way to push back against rot and ruin, a way to say, I may not control the sky, but by the gods, I will scrub this fish blood out of my husband's dinner sash. So next time you toss a Tide Pod into your washer without a second thought, imagine crouching beside a fire, stirring goat sludge into a vat, while your neighbor yells about his missing loincloth. That's what clean smelled like, and you better believe they earned it. Reflective line. Ancient science didn't sparkle, but it did blister. Her name is Iltani, and she is 7 years old. Today, she graduates from watching the grown-ups at the wash zone to joining them. Not by choice, of course. No child volunteers to wake up before dawn to stomp linen under a sky that smells like burnt millet and wet clay. But today, her mother handed her a small sash, woven months ago by her grandmother. It's thin, frayed, and smells faintly of fish oil and old prayers. It is also filthy, and it is Iltani's to clean. This is her rite of passage, not marked by ceremonies or songs, but by suds and sore ankles. The morning is thick with humidity, the kind that makes your tunic cling like gilt. She walks barefoot behind her mother, carrying a clay pot full of water on one hip, and a bar of soap the size of her own foot in the other. The soap is hard, gritty, and smells like regrets, the good kind, the kind with ash, salt, and crushed fig skin. Her uncle made it last week. He makes it strong so it lasts longer, or so he said. The wash zone is a semicircular pit lined with flat stones, about a 10-minute walk from their house. It overlooks the canal, where other families are already drawing water, whispering gossip, and avoiding eye contact with anyone they argued with last week. Iltani steps into the pit. The stones are still slick from the last wash, and the water is cold enough to steal your breath. Her mother nods at her to begin. She drops the sash into the basin. At first, she hesitates. The water ripples as the fabric settles, a pale ghost sinking into muddy liquid. She doesn't know how hard to press, so she presses too hard and splashes herself. Her mother says nothing, just watches. Silent approval is the most she'll get today. She grabs the soap and begins to rub. At first, the motions are awkward. The sash curls away like a wet snake. Her small hands fumble, her knuckles scrape against the clay basin's rim. The ash-laced soap stings, but the smell of sweat and stale oil slowly lifts. The fabric brightens. The water darkens. Across the pit, another woman chuckles. First time, she calls. Iltani flushes. Her mother responds with a tight smile, and nothing else. The sun climbs. The pit heats. Steam rises from the warm water. Iltani is sweating now, not from the heat, but from the effort. Her feet ache. Her shoulders burn. But she keeps scrubbing. Rub, rinse, wring, repeat. She looks up and sees an older girl, maybe 12, watching her from across the canal with a half smile. The girl lifts her foot and begins to stomp on a tunic in her own basin. Slow, rhythmic, confident. Iltani mimics her, 1 foot at a time, pressing the sash beneath her soles like she's heard the grown-ups do. It works, sort of. The fabric squishes satisfyingly under her feet. The bubbles foam. A small rush of pride rises in her chest, until she slips. 1 foot flies forward, the other backward, and she lands hard on her side in the water. Her mother doesn't laugh. She simply pulls her out, checks for bruises, and hands her back the sash. Try again. No lecture, no sympathy. Just another lesson. The wash doesn't wait for bruises. So she does. Rub. Rinse. Wring. Repeat. The sash grows lighter, softer, clean. By midday, her hands are raw and tingling. The soap has left tiny red lines across her palms. Her hair clings to her face. Her back screams with each bend. But she doesn't stop. When she finally lifts the sash from the water and wrings it out one last time, She notices something. It shines. Not like gold. There is no glamour here, but like effort, like accomplishment. Her mother nods. Now hang it. She takes the sash to the drying rack, a wooden beam strung between two posts. She throws it over and watches it drip, drip, drip. The sun will do the rest. She stares at it for a moment. It's not just clean. It's transformed. It smells faintly of ash and fig. It is something she saved, with her own hands, with her own feet. It's no longer just a sash. It's proof. Her mother begins to pack up. The other washerwomen are laughing again, gossiping about whose cousin flirted with a fish merchant, and whether it was appropriate during mourning season. But Iltani stays. She wants to watch it dry, wants to remember the exact way it looks, damp but victorious, because today something changed. This morning she was a child. Now she's part of the wash. That evening, her mother takes the sash down. It is dry, scratchy, stiff in places, but clean. She folds it carefully and places it in the household basket of linens. Iltani touches it one last time before it disappears. She smiles. She smiled when the tunic came clean, like she'd done something sacred. The house is quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes after a festival or a thunderstorm. This is the still, heavy silence of mourning, the kind of quiet that presses against the walls. Thick as smoke. Someone has died. And now, there is laundry to do. Yes, even in death, there is laundry. In ancient Babylon, burial wasn't just a matter of wrapping the body and digging a hole. It was a ritual, a responsibility, a farewell whispered through cloth and water. The final wash wasn't just for the living to grieve. It was to cleanse the soul's exit. Quite literally, this is where we meet Enlil Nasir, a middle-aged man whose name roughly means Enlil protects. Except today, Enlil didn't protect him from a sudden fever that bloomed in the chest and burned hot until, eventually, it didn't burn at all. His wife, Amat, is left behind. And like every widow before her, she must do the last wash, not of his body. The priests will handle that, dousing him with ritual water and sacred oils while chanting hymns to the netherworld. No, Amat is washing his burial garments. 2 linen tunics, a woven sash, and a head wrap embroidered by her own mother decades ago. She doesn't cry. Not yet. There's no time. She gathers the garments, still folded from their ceremonial chest, and walks to the washing pit. It's still early. The sun hasn't scorched the courtyard into a kiln just yet. She fills the basin with river water, cold and reluctant, and begins. She doesn't stomp. This isn't that kind of wash. Instead, she kneels beside the stone basin and slowly presses the fabric down with her hands. She doesn't reach for soap. She doesn't want his scent erased. She just wants the dust gone. The weeks of waiting, of illness, of not knowing what to do. The linen floats in the basin like a ghost catching its breath. Amat remembers when he first wore the head wrap, the spring festival. How proud he looked, how tight it had been tied by mistake. He'd laughed, adjusted it, and said something about fashion being a form of suffering. She presses it gently under the water, watching as small bubbles escape. Linen sighs when you press it just right. Or maybe that's just what she hears now. In Babylonian tradition, the dead were washed, wrapped, and anointed before being sent into the underworld. The clothes had to be clean, not out of vanity, but respect. The soul needed dignity to face the gods of the deep. If it appeared before Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, in stained robes, well, who knows? But no one wanted to find out. So, Amat keeps scrubbing. Not hard. Not too long. Just enough to say, I did this for you. Some believe the water carries prayers, that each rinse whispers to the divine. Take this one gently. Let the journey be soft. Let the gods be merciful. Others say it's simply a way to keep your hands busy while your heart breaks. Both can be true. As the sun rises, light glints off the water, the courtyard slowly warms. Her neighbour passes by, nods silently, and leaves a handful of herbs near the gate. Rosemary and crushed juniper, a traditional offering. Neither woman speaks. By mid-morning the tunics are clean. Amatret wrings them carefully. The fabric is delicate, older than she remembered. Each thread feels like memory. She hangs them on a rope strung low between 2 clay posts, careful not to let them touch the ground. They sway in the breeze, drying slowly, patient, ceremonial. She sits nearby, watching. Not because she needs to, but because she can't look away. This is the last time she'll see these clothes. After the burial, they'll remain with him, laid over his chest, wrapped around his arms. There will be no grave goods too poor for that, but there will be these garments. Clean, soft, touched by her hands. She remembers the time he spilled beer down one of these tunics, 3 years ago at his cousin's wedding. They'd laughed so hard they both snorted. He made a joke about how barley stains were just good luck in disguise. She'd rolled her eyes and washed it before the yeast set in. She remembers fixing a fray in the sash, hiding the mended part with an extra knot. He never noticed, or if he did, he never said. Now she watches them dry. The final hour. The head wrap dries last. Always did. The embroidery threads take longer to breathe. She runs a hand over the cloth one final time and folds it gently. The priest will come soon, with his oil and chants. But Amit's part is done. She's given him what little she could, a clean tunic, a dignified farewell, and a memory wrapped in linen. It is, in its own quiet way, an act of love. Some say the cleanest you'll ever be is just before burial. After that, there's only dust. But Amit doesn't think of dust. She thinks of cool water, of steady hands, of linen that still smells faintly of him. She thinks of silence, and what it means to fill it with care. It was the cleanest he'd ever been, just in time to leave it all behind. Let's fast forward a few millennia. You right now probably have a washer-dryer combo that sings a little jingle when it's done. You toss your clothes in, press a button that says delicates, even though you're washing gym socks, and walk away like a laundry wizard. Maybe you light a candle. Maybe you fold with a podcast on. But here's the uncomfortable question. Are we actually better at laundry than the Babylonians? Sure, we're not collecting public urine in jars or stomping tunics barefoot in sun-baked basins. But consider this. Most people today have no idea what their clothes are made of, let alone how to care for them. Labels? Ignored. Settings? Misunderstood. The lint trap? A terrifying mystery until it catches fire. And that's not even mentioning the environmental cost. Every spin cycle pulls electricity from a grid, powered by, well, mostly disappointment. Microplastics leach from synthetic fabrics and swirl into oceans. Detergents promise ocean breeze freshness while slowly choking coral reefs with phosphates. Somewhere, a sea turtle is coughing up a glittery sock. Still feel superior to ancient Babylon? Let's talk effort. Modern laundry feels automated, detached. You could, theoretically, do your laundry without ever touching it. Pickup services, folding robots, smart detergent pods with QR codes and pH balancing enzymes harvested from volcanic algae. But something's missing, isn't it? When you watch an automatic machine slosh your t-shirts behind glass, it feels more like watching a mildly interesting fish tank than a meaningful act. There's no contact, no weight, no ritual, no memory. The Babylonians? They felt it. Every wash was a choreographed mess of muscle, mud, and emotional stamina. You couldn't zone out, not while scrubbing blood from ceremonial robes or bleaching louse eggs from a child's cloak. Modern life has efficiency. Ancient life had presence. Even our smells have changed. Clean today smells like artificial mountain air. Back then, it was a complex bouquet of ash, sun-dried flax, foot sweat, and river silt. Was it better? No, but it was real. You knew what you were getting. Laundry today is a war against time. Back then, it was a war against entropy. But let's not romanticize grime. You're not a worse person because you don't stomp on socks for 2 hours under a Mesopotamian sun. There's something to be said for convenience. Ancient washerwomen would have sacrificed a goat for a spin cycle. Still, the detachment matters. Today, laundry is often invisible labor, still gendered, still unspoken. Someone's folding, someone's sorting. And unless you're doing it yourself, you probably don't notice. So, here's your modern-day reflection point. When was the last time you thanked someone for laundry? Think of all the clothes you didn't wash. The shirts that came back folded. The sheets that appeared magically crisp. Someone touched those, scrubbed them, pressed them, whether it was your mother, your partner, or a hotel worker you never saw. Their effort wrapped around you every morning. Now zoom out. In factories across the globe, anonymous hands wash, bleach, dye, and fold millions of garments. Many of those workers aren't paid enough to buy the very clothes they clean. The invisible labor of Babylon hasn't disappeared. It's just been outsourced. The washerwoman hasn't vanished. She's just working 3 shifts in Bangladesh. That ancient hierarchy we laughed at? It's still here, just hidden under a mountain of branded packaging and 2-day shipping. But not all is lost. Ritual can return. You could turn laundry into a slow act again. Touch the fabric, smell the detergent, fold with attention. Think of who will wear it next. Play a little music. Say a silent thanks to whoever invented that miracle stain remover that got ketchup out of your favorite hoodie. Because every spin cycle is a quiet tribute to the tired washerman of Babylon, to your grandmother's calloused fingers, to every overlooked act of care performed in silence. Clothing carries memory, and laundry is how we honor it. A child's sash, cleaned for the first time. A burial tunic, folded with reverence. A lover's shirt, kept a day longer, just to inhale the scent. These are human things, the unglamorous threads of intimacy. So next time you do laundry, don't just do it. Notice it. Honor it. Let that wash cycle echo a few thousand years back to the riverbeds, to the cracked feet, to the hands that scrubbed and wrung and hoped they'd done enough.
Are we better than them?
Not really. We're just different. More buttons, less barefoot, same dust. And for that, maybe be a little grateful. Maybe fold your shirt like someone's watching. Because in a way they are. Still awake? Or maybe just cleaner in spirit? If you've made it through Babylon's laundry list of horrors, you deserve a gold-stitched tunic and a subscription badge. Hit that like button like you're stomping sandals in a soap vat, and stay tuned for more weird, wonderful, and filthy truths from Boring History for Sleep.